The new US tariffs are an act of aggression, which is why Canada is officially at war with America. This statement was made today by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The head of the Canadian government stated that the Canadian side has withdrawn from trade negotiations with the Americans due to the unacceptable terms of the agreement. He called the new American tariffs on Canadian goods an act of aggression, and according to Carney, Canada is now in a state of open war. Therefore, Ottawa will introduce reciprocal tariffs against the United States of America. Trump himself stated that Canada is wrong because, as he put it, they want the same conditions as a US state without actually being one. However, some sources claim that the breakdown of trade negotiations between the US and Canada was due to changes that the Canadian side introduced at a late stage of the discussions. The Canadians say that's not true, it was the Americans who introduced certain conditions at the last minute, which is why the deal fell through. At the same time, American economists are convinced that Donald Trump's new trade war will primarily hurt the United States itself, not Canada. That's why Canada has, as they say, some staying power, and it doesn't have to make concessions. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this trade war between Canada and the USA together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and don't forget to leave your comment under this video, maybe even while you're watching the episode. So as you know, recently Canada and the USA failed to reach a trade agreement and Trump imposed new tariffs on Canadian goods. And now, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, stated that after the introduction of new tariffs by the US, the country is now in a state of war. Here is his quote. "We have been attacked. You are in a state of war when you are attacked, and we have just been attacked." And according to Carney, a few minutes before midnight on Friday, Canada withdrew from the negotiations. The reason was the changes that the US made to the agreement at the last minute. Carney stated that these changes, quote, were unfair, uneconomical, and called into question the reliability of any agreement. This is Carney's first decision to introduce new tariffs against the US since he was elected Prime Minister in the spring of last year. This move marks a new serious escalation in relations between the two countries. Carney mentioned several contentious points in the last week of negotiations that ultimately led to the breakdown of the deal. Among them were provisions regarding tariffs for the automotive industry, as well as attempts to limit Canada's right to protect, as Carney put it, its language, its culture, and essentially its sovereignty. In particular, it was about protecting the French language in Quebec. According to Carney, the US also demanded to limit Canada's right to enter into trade agreements with other countries, particularly with India, the United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia. And this is a really tough wording because the Americans were basically saying, okay, you trade with us and no one else. We'll decide which countries you can trade with and which ones you can't. The American side included the corresponding wording in the agreement in the final hours before the deadline. And Carney emphasized that such a condition would always be unacceptable for this government. That was his quote. Carney added that even if an agreement was reached with the US, it would still remain unreliable. Why? And here is Carney's quote. "Our government realized before many others that America would change all its trade relations, will introduce a series of tariffs against its closest allies, and will use economic integration as a weapon. We admit that sometimes it was signed in pencil. Well, I mean any agreement with the Americans." Prime Minister of Canada also hinted at disagreements within the American negotiating team, which led to last-minute changes being made to the agreement. Here's another quote. "The Canadian team was united, but the same can't be said about the United States administration. Disagreements within the Trump administration were documented right up until the moment when both sides began to coordinate the smallest details of the agreement this week." And the problem is that now not only the review of the relationship between the US and Canada is at risk, but also the review of the trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico. And after the breakdown of the negotiations, the US accused Canada of being the one that led them to fail. US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer stated on social media as early as Friday evening that Washington had offered Canada the best terms among all major exporters to the American market. However, new demands from Ottawa and its refusal of previously reached agreements, Greer tells us, disrupted the balance that the parties had achieved over the past few days. And on Saturday morning, that same Greer added that no new negotiations are planned yet. According to him, the US is beginning preparations for, quote, a response to the Canadian countermeasures. Well, in short, a new cycle of tariffs is starting, because obviously the Americans impose theirs, Canada responds with its own tariffs, the Americans respond to the counter-tariffs with theirs, Canada responds again, and so it goes in circles. And today, the New York Times writes that although Trump's tariffs cover only a small portion of Canadian goods, they could quickly escalate. If Canada really resorts to countermeasures, and it will, and Trump responds in the same way, and he will, the result could be a whole series of new shocks for the United States economy at a time when it is already experiencing many difficulties. Instability accompanied the entire second term of President Trump, as the unpredictable tariffs of the US president openly caused turmoil on Wall Street, irritate American allies, and contribute to rising prices for consumer goods in the domestic market. As for Canada, a new conflict could become a serious burden for businesses trading across the US-Canadian border. Raising tariffs in response could affect prices and consequently lead to reduced investment and weakened economic activity as long as this complicated trade situation persists. Ultimately, Donald Trump could prevent a disaster and still reach an agreement with Canada. But no, wait, the sides aren't even negotiating now, and Trump believes he's doing the right thing, that supposedly he'll pressure Canada and Canada will eventually make concessions. In response to the new American tariffs, Canada is not making any concessions and isn't showing any intention of making concessions at all. Prime Minister Mark Carney threatened to announce his own tariff measures against the United States, targeting sectors such as agriculture, metallurgy, and electronics. And let me remind you here, the new tariffs imposed by Donald Trump, set at 50%, apply to Canadian exports to the United States, worth about $20 billion. The list of goods includes hundreds of items, in particular hockey sticks, furniture, and dairy products made in Canada, the import of which may become too expensive for American consumers. A cycle of mutual countermeasures could complicate the US fight against inflation, which remains significantly above the 2% target. 2% that the Federal Reserve focuses on, despite Trump's arguments that everything in the economy is just great under him. The economy is soaring. And for example, the rise in prices actually forced the US president this week. You know what he had to do? To ease tariffs on imported beef. Well, because prices went up too much, he says. Oh, fine. And do you know what that means? It's an admission that his trade policy hit Americans in their wallets. Well, on this YouTube channel a year ago we discussed, and I said that this would specifically hit the average American who goes to the store. And Trump said, no, come on, absolutely not. The tariffs will be paid by the importer, not the buyer. No way. But that's complete nonsense. Of course, all of this gets included in the price later, and here's proof of that. So, when Trump realized that beef prices were skyrocketing, he can't do anything about it. So, what does he do? He lowers the tariff. After lowering the tariff, the price of beef also went down. Do you think these things are connected after all? I think so. Economic concerns are increasingly spreading to financial markets as well. There is growing worry about the rising debt burden of the United States, which this week reached $40 trillion. This contributed to a sharp increase in government bond yields. The war with Iran also played a role. It created economic challenges, holding back global growth and causing fuel prices to rise. And some Democrats in Congress criticizing Trump in recent days have pointed out additional risks. They argue that his threats against Canada could have real negative economic consequences for the United States. And now Trump has gotten himself into a new trade war again. And he is confident that he will definitely win it. But judging by Canada's behavior, they are not going to back down or give in. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.